Yeah, so no, grateful to be here. This is a passion of mine, and I always welcome the opportunity to share some knowledge and yeah, take some notes, take some screenshots. We'll have some time at the end. This is about 45, 50-ish minutes, so I will speak quite fast at times, but again, happy to answer questions and share resources as time goes on. So. Just so I know who I'm speaking to, we got people from all over the system. Is that right? Fargo, Brainerd, Duluth. Okay.
Correct. Yep. So you have the RN UM review team and possibly some CDI review nurses from across the system. So Duluth, Brainerd, Fargo, Detroit Lakes, everywhere in between.
Great. And then a mixture of RN / other training backgrounds?
Most, about 99% RNs.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. See a little bit about me. St. John's grad, went to the med school at the U, residency at the U, hospitalist at the U, and then I've been here for 6 years, almost 7 years. Family medicine, board certified, hospital medicine, the section chair and division chair, and then talking to you about this today, weight management specialty, and then board certification a couple years ago, and top doc in Minnesota a couple years ago as well. So yep, there's the fam, my wife Ashley, 2 little girls, Avery and Quinn, down in Crosby, where we like to go biking. So my story starts, and I think a lot of physicians or providers in this field of obesity, lifestyle medicine, they really get into it by way of a personal experience, and that leads to a professional transformation and then the impact and inspiring of others. So a good friend of mine, a doctor named Ryan Krushel in Mora a couple years ago, was visiting, and he said, his proposal was, let's either go to Hawaii tomorrow, which wasn't really possible, or let's run a marathon. And I wasn't a runner, but considering the Hawaii thing was off the table, decided I'd train with Ryan. We trained the whole year, ran 400 some miles, like the equivalent from St. Paul to Chicago. And it was great. It was painful and challenging, but it was awesome to have finished that, having my wife and kids at the finish line and so forth. Throughout that process, though, having trained a whole bunch and being a relatively young, healthy, fit guy, I did what I thought I was supposed to. I ate the foods that we were told to eat, lots of starches and carb loading before longer runs, and was cross training and so forth. And I lost 7 pounds, and having gained a lot of weight in med school and residency, I was happy with this. But I also recognized that after the race is over, in the fall, I wouldn't have a lot of capital left. My wife was exhausted from me being gone. I was newly in, attending physician. It was going to be winter, et cetera. So I realized something else had to change. And it's kind of one of those moments that I won't forget of kind of having one of these realizations that, I really can't exercise my way out of my weight problems, my metabolic health problems I was struggling with. Again, having put on 30 some pounds during med school and residency. So this led me to think about a lecture that I had heard the spring before at our spring conference here at Essentia at one of the resorts, the spring of 15. Some of you may remember Dr. Park. He was now retired, but obesity doc at Ely, practiced throughout the range and saw people virtually throughout the system. And I remember Dr. Park talking about this, the spring of 16, this whole sort of theory or processes of carbohydrate metabolism and insulin function. And I remember pulling it up on a PowerPoint a couple of weeks after I finished the race, thinking about these concepts and terms that I hadn't really considered since med school. And I wondered if I was maybe missing something. And this led me to dive into his presentation again, and really kind of look at what I was eating. And I realized quite quickly that what I was eating wasn't fitting with my goals. So as sort of a self-study and N of 1 experiment, if you will, for the next 6 months coming into the spring of 17, I cut out my carbs significantly, focused on meal planning with my family, and mostly eating real foods when I was hungry. Not necessarily keto, but definitely a low carb, kind of a paleo, a mix, and didn't exercise. I snowshoed a few times, but didn't run at all. And I achieved the weight that I last weighed in college / high school with relative ease, without hunger or cravings. Mood was better, mental clarity, doing 12-hour hospital shifts was rock solid, reflux gone, eczema gone, all my metabolic markers of health were normal. And this kind of led me to realize that, geez, I mean, if I, a physician and a supposed expert in wellness and lifestyle and preventative health, struggled and saw this transformation, like it's a tool, it's something that I needed to share and learn more about. So what I'm going to chat with you more about is just how this has changed me, and I think by way of the last few years, really our community, and I think the way we look at weight and obesity as a health system, as I've had a pretty big impact in some of these things at a higher level with collaborations that I'll get to. So, but most importantly, like I didn't know how to cook, I didn't know how to plan meals, didn't have a garden, raise chickens. All these things kind of came out of this birth of understanding self and nutrition and physiology. I don't know how much of this you had in nursing school. I didn't have really any of it in med school or residency, other than here's the food pyramid. These are what we call statins, and good luck. So having really to teach myself from the ground up about nutrition and food and this is the basics of insulin physiology. It's just led me to question the paradigm of weight and metabolic health and our dietary guidelines. Really changed my clinical management of obesity and diabetes, starting with my primary care patients the spring of 17, and now growing out into the specialty. You can't see this, but I'm in a hallway at BMC with a team that now includes 9 people and a 3 to 6 month waiting list, and some pretty inspiring outcomes. Which today I've seen 3 people that have each individually lost a triple-digit amount of weight, and they're off many medicines and have their lives back. And finally, things like today, I've talked to family medicine, internal medicine, obstetrics, hospital medicine, and now utilization management about this aspect of health and wellness, nutrition, mindset, et cetera. And grateful to be here today. And finally, I would be much more burnt out than I am. That's mostly thanks to COVID and my hospital roles. But my joy, I was about to leave primary care and clinic altogether in 17. I wasn't really happy with what I was doing in the clinic. I felt like I was on a treadmill and not helping people really much at all. But that's completely transformed. I give more high fives and hugs in a day than I would have in months or even a year before. So my own burnout is really minimal compared to where it was before, thanks to the work I get to do. And I think that aspect of joy is, we know that's one of our key values at Essentia, and I think is the most important value. So we're going to talk about a few more things here: evolution of human nutrition, the origins of this epidemic, what insulin resistance means, how it pertains to adiposity or weight, fat gain, what low carb, healthy fat or high fat lifestyle looks like, what the evidence is, what an actual clinic visit looks like here, things that are happening in our community, and then just some resources to take away. Everybody good so far? Wonderful. So this could be a whole nother presentation, and this is very simplified, I understand, but I hope it gives you just a 30,000 foot view of where we've come from and where we are. So we've been in a hunting society or species for a very long time. I'm estimating here for the purposes of this presentation, so let's just call it 100,000 generations, dating to our pre-human Homo erectus ancestors and now on forward, to really be an opportunistic group of hairless apes, if you will, who thrived in communities, hunting and gathering together, eating mostly meats, fiber-rich plants, fish with the occasional nuts and berries and honey. So that occasional glucose source, but primarily fats and proteins. Calories were scarce, situational, seasonal, and required lots of time and effort to acquire. And this way of living, this way of evolving, was by no means easy, but through it we have found ourselves to be the only remaining Homo genus. So the other Homo genuses are no longer living. We are the remaining one that is left, and we have thrived from this foundational way of feeling ourselves. Fast forward to today, there are still modern day humans or people that are living in this day and age who follow this way of living, and though there's not many left, I have had a chance to spend time with some in different parts of the world, including the Maasai people and the plains of East Africa, where they eat these same things: meats, fish, beef, some occasional veggies and plants. Dairy is dependent on the location, but not a whole lot of processed foods. Maybe some honey and fruits, but there's no grocery stores, there's no gym memberships or things like that. And it's remarkable, lots of these remaining modern day hunter-gatherer societies are for their lack of chronic disease, cancers, heart disease, diabetes, and hypertension. And certainly the life expectancy is challenged, and one would argue the quality of life can be challenged through other processes such as infection and trauma and the things that come with having a scarcity of resources at times. Regardless, those adults that are there and living this way still, for the most part, as hunters-gatherers, sometimes farmers, are lean and metabolically healthy, such as that shown on the right. And that used to be the way that we all would have looked, our ancestors would have looked for the most part. Fast forward to the development of agriculture, and the Neolithic revolution in Mesopotamia, production of starches such as corn, wheat, and rice in different parts of the world. This is about 10,000 years ago, plus or minus 500 generations ago, to keep it simple. And with this, it's kind of interesting. This is a study looked at with radiographic imaging of mummies' arteries, and they noted that people of higher societal status in ancient Egypt that could afford having servants who had ground starch, mostly corn and wheat for them, and ate that diet had a higher degree of calcified coronary plaques versus the lower caste or level people that couldn't afford those foods and were probably more opportunistic in their dietary habits. So already we have some, not cause and effect, but some interesting association between dietary choices, agriculture, and then the development of inflammation, at least in the arteries. More recently, the sugar revolution, we all know this, was founded on the backbone of slavery and has tragically led to the increase of sugar throughout the diet of most people in the world. And this, again, looking at it from a generational standpoint, isn't all that long ago. So mid 1700s, 25 generations prior to this, a rich European was probably the only person in the world, or maybe somebody in Southeast Asia, who would have consumed sugar with any regularity, probably in their tea, and it was a sign of status and wealth. But with the advent of the sugar revolution and sugarcane, that rapidly changed. And here we are now, right? So the mass production of sugar and flour in this post-industrial state is everywhere. This stuff is cheap. It lasts forever on the shelf. It's engineered to be addictive and taste good. And it's secretly and sort of stealthily in many foods that we are around us. So going from an upper range of normal of somebody who would have consumed 15 to 20 pounds of sugar a year a couple hundred years ago to now the average being, and this is from like 2008, I believe, of 130 pounds a year, a whole wheelbarrow full. We sort of wonder, like, what's the outcome of this going to be? We all know it's not good. When you combine the processed food industry and its escalating numbers of products and volumes with our guidelines, which again we all know, those of us that remember the 80s and beyond here, this is something that we would have all seen in school, right? So that eat your whole grains, that's the foundation, have fruits and vegetables, and as you go higher to the top, there's less meats, there's less dairy, and of course, sweets should be eaten sparingly. And so with this, going back here a couple generations now, we have this sort of villainization of saturated fat without any evidence. Meanwhile, carbohydrates are promoted, particularly processed carbohydrates, sugars and starches as the backbone of our guidelines. And if you follow the guidelines, and many people do, or started to, I should say, in the 80s, that's 6 to 11 servings a day of rice, pasta, bread, and cereal. 325 grams of carbs on the upper limit of normal there if you follow that. Meanwhile, it's saying to limit the animal protein and use fats and oils or saturated fats and oils, which are solids at room temperature sparingly. Again, putting this in perspective, this is 30 years ago. I was alive then. Most of us were. It's just a generation and a half. It's not a long time. So here we go. As a summary, imagine that a clock, or a day, I should say, is 24 hours. We flourished on a real food, nutrient-dense, relatively low carb, depending on the time and the part of the world you'd be in, higher fat, higher protein diet for 23 hours, 56 and a half minutes. Started eating processed foods and processed starches, I should say, that were farmed 5 minutes ago, consuming sugar in high quantities 11 seconds ago, and then following the guidelines, including the mass quantities of refined carbs 2 seconds ago. So this is our current food environment, right? So common to you and I, but not 99.99999% of our evolutionary history. And that's, again, 2 seconds, a relatively rapid transformation in our food environment. And the outcomes here are quite tragic and obvious. So jumping on to the origins of the epidemic, many of you have maybe heard of this gentleman's name, Dr. Ansel Keys. He was actually a doctor at the University of Minnesota and is credited with kind of beginning the diet heart sort of connection with his hypothesis that eating diets high in cholesterol and saturated fat would lead to elevated serum cholesterol and lipid markers, thereby causing coronary calcifications and heart disease. This was based on Ansel's 7-country study, which began in the 50s. He published in 1970. And he looked at the eating habits via surveys and visiting multiple countries throughout Europe and the world and plotted his data as shown here. This is what Keys published here. If you can see my cursor on the left, he plotted all the way from Japan through the United States, people who generally ate less fat, he showed in this study, to have less incidence of heart disease. What he neglected with just, I would argue, scientific abandon was the other countries for which he had data. When you plot all those countries on his graph, you can see it's a complete flat line. There's no connection. And tragically, this led subsequently to the sort of the beginnings of our dietary guidelines, of this villainization of fat, and the promotion of dietary carbohydrates, to the shift that we now find ourselves in. So many people at the time and currently say it's almost inconceivable that this was ever even published. And I would argue that it's probably the greatest human experiment gone wrong. At the time, the McGovern Commission, so the U.S. Senate, had hearings on this. Dr. Harcum from the UK has published on this significantly, where people are arguing, hey, there's no consensus here, that this could result in drastic physical and metabolic harm to our nation. And at the time, there was only 6 RCTs, randomized controlled trials. One Keyes published this data, and there was no relationship found, other than his flawed study between dietary saturated fat and heart disease. Needless to say, this is what we got ourselves in 1984. Mass media took hold, and this is the cover of Time in '84. Cholesterol, the bad news. And again, as I just said a few minutes ago, it's a colossal experiment gone wrong. There's no data at the time, nor has there been since then, at this level to support the evidence, or sorry, to give evidence to support this drastic recommendation of a one-size-fits-all. Here's the pyramid. This is the healthy American diet. And generally, and this varies from person to person, but we have as a nation followed some of these recommendations and have decreased our fat, have decreased our cholesterol intake, have decreased our animal protein intake, whereby then increasing significantly our amount of sugar and refined carbohydrates to levels that, as we just reviewed, have been unforeseen and previously in human history. People call low carb, paleo, keto a fad diet. I'd argue that this is the ultimate fad diet, having been around for a generation and a half and being not solely responsible, but certainly impactful. I'm not putting all the blame on this, but a big player in the detrimental state our nation finds its health in. So on the surface, these things look like healthy grains, right? Recommended as the foundation of our diet, but below the surface, our basic nutritional biochemistry would tell us that, here we go, all these things break down into a similar common pathway of glucose. So polysaccharides are monosaccharides branched together by these bonds, and by way of our enzymes in our body and our GI system, those are cleaved and separated, glucose being the final common outcome of that. That leads to elevations in blood sugar. Pretty straightforward. This is from Dr. Westman, my mentor at Duke, and I have this in all my patients' rooms. And when I first saw it, it really blew my mind, and it still does. And just to think that if, let's just say, a normal human blood sugar is 100, I'd argue that's a little high, but just by doing some basic math there, that comes out to about 5 grams of sugar, glucose, sugar, not the same thing, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll call them the same. That 5 grams of glucose sugar is about a teaspoon of sugar. So that's how much I have as a person with roughly 5 or 6 liters of circulating blood have in my entire system, a single teaspoon. People that are pre-diabetic or diabetic, maybe they have a teaspoon and a half, but we're not talking about cups full. So just to think about this for a moment, we're talking about, if you follow the guidelines, you're eating between 225 to 325 grams a day. Most people I see for consultation are in that range. I just told you that our bloodstream has a single teaspoon. So what is the outcome going to be if we do some math here and say that on average, that recommendation to eat such amounts of carbs is a cup to a cup and a third of sugar a day into a highly evolved and efficient system, our body, that functions optimally with a single teaspoon. It's no wonder that we find ourselves in the state of rampant hyperinsulinemia, metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, and obesity. And yes, that single teaspoon is recirculated and reused, depending on how healthy you are, every 30 to 60 minutes. So that is not a uniform amount for the day. But regardless, the amount that we're told to eat is drastically above what we're eating. This is from Dr. Unwin, a friend at the UK, who recently received Physician of the Year award for the public health system in England for his very simple to read, easy to follow sort of teaspoon equivalent. So he has this for lunches and dinners and a whole slew of different foods. And it's kind of really powerful when you just break this down for people and patients, that you wake up and you have the healthy bran cereal, your cup of milk, maybe a piece of toast and apple juice, and holy cow, you're already at 16 teaspoons and you haven't even got to lunch yet. And if you're in the 88% of Americans that are not metabolically healthy, the outcome of this is going to be challenging to your metabolic health and weight over time. Yet still, we have, I would argue, also disastrous and flawed recommendations by the AHA to eat these healthy things, right? They're low in cholesterol, but completely neglected is the fact that they're loaded with sugar. So I tell people to look at a nutrition label as a warning label and really to be a detective as it pertains to the quality of the foods you're eating. And when you see this AHA sign, stay away from it. It's likely a very highly processed food. I mean, does anybody really think that Trix is healthy for anybody's heart? I'm just saying. So let's look a bit at the timeline here. So launch of the dietary guidelines, post Keys flawed data here is about 1980, plus or minus a couple of years. And we see, and this graph ends prematurely here in 2010, but this uptick in the percentage of overweight and obese Americans. That line has only gotten higher since this graph was published. As we go on here, I want to just show you the natural history of type 2 diabetes. So let's say time 0 is time of diagnosis. That's when a patient sees a physician or provider and they're told, you're hyperglycemic, your A1C is up, it's 7, for example. Sure, that's legit. That's time 0. But if we go backwards from time 0, we can see that 5 or 10 years previous to that, maybe even 15 or 20, we've already got developing insulin resistance. We've got these rises in postprandial glucose that are subtle, oftentimes not even noticed because people don't feel them unless you're wearing a CGM or a glucose monitor or checking your fingers. And meanwhile, you've got this compensatory rise in insulin secretion or the development of insulin resistance. So just keep this in mind. Estimating 5 to 10 years before type 2, we've already seen the physiologic changes. And I'll just, as a side note, say I see people commonly in this -5 to -10 category regularly. I love getting consults when people are seeing us with high insulin levels but normal A1Cs. That's where we really have an opportunity to prevent and then reverse any metabolic dysfunction that may be on the horizon. Similarly here, dietary guidelines. This is diabetes percentage of the population in millions. Jumping in here in the late 70s, early 80s, and you can see here 10 years later, knowing that, as I just told you, there's this 10-year sort of incubation period from intervention or change to then development of hyperglycemia. Here we are. We see that in the early 90s and certainly the late 90s, there's this huge uptick in the percentage of Americans with diabetes and insulin resistance. We've all seen this many times. These colors have. There's no orange. There's no yellow or light brown left. It's all red. And this is 2015, 5 years ago. And we all know COVID has accelerated those colors. We're having to add new colors to this graph just to account for the changes in the incidence and prevalence of diabetes and obesity. And Crow Wing County, where I'm speaking to you from and where I live, there's no exception. I mean, this is a survey from a couple of years ago from Crow Wing Energized, and it's showing that again, there's a huge percentage of people that we know and love that may be us. It certainly was me who would fall into these categories of having obesity, high blood pressure, mental health concerns, etc. And just to show you the age-adjusted prevalence of obesity and diabetes among U.S. adults from 2 million BC to 1980. It's all white. I mean, I'm sharing this with a bit of humor, but yes, indeed, through most of, I would argue, the 20th century, there would have been no color. You wouldn't have needed a map to show the incidence or prevalence of these things because they weren't there or they were extremely rare. But now most of the country is having to find itself in deeper shades of red to indicate those changes. Let's talk about insulin resistance and adiposity. So insulin, I want you to think of it as the hormone, this chief or regulatory hormone, this anabolic hormone released by the beta cells in our pancreas. It's sort of like our mother. It wants to tidy things up. It wants to tuck things away, particularly glucose and other forms of energy. It's anabolic in the sense that it promotes glucose oxidation. It promotes glycogenesis, in other words, storing glucose in the muscle and liver. It prevents the breakdown of glycogen into energy, and it also prevents the development or the production of glucose from the liver, called gluconeogenesis. And just as importantly, and this is kind of the main thing that I remembered from Dr. Park's lecture back in the spring of 16 after the marathon and so forth, is that it inhibits the breakdown of fat and fatty acid oxidation or the utilization of fat for energy. Here it is in sort of the cellular form. Sorry, a little PTSD back to nursing school here, but the Krebs cycle. You can just see here as glucose enters the cell, it undergoes glycolysis, the TCA cycle. It's converted into acetyl-CoA, and then it's stored in cells as fatty acids. So it promotes this really key central concept, this physiologic process called de novo, or sort of from the beginning lipogenesis, or the creation of fat. It turns glucose into fatty acids and stores them as fat. That is a chief role of insulin. And over different macronutrient behaviors here, or intakes, you can see that carbs spike insulin really significantly. Protein, about half, or to some degree in fat, it's quite flat. Very, very little response. Hyperlinks anemia is just that. It's elevated levels of serum insulin in either the fasted or postprandial state as measured by a blood test. And this is partially it's multifactorial and partially genetics, and one could argue sleep and perhaps sleep apnea, sometimes medications can contribute, but chiefly from a behavioral standpoint, it is largely due to the excessive and repetitive intake of processed starches and sugars over time. This promotes fat deposition and inhibits fat breakdown, as I just mentioned, in the liver. And the way I like to explain this to patients is, as you choose to eat these things over time, insulin is secreted by the pancreas. Again, anabolically, it's turning the ingested glucose into stored fat. And those cells our fat cells, depending on your genes, can become 20 to 30 times their normal size. They can really, really grow. They can hypertrophy. But as those cells reach a significant level of carrying capacity, it's like they put their arms up and say, I can't take any more stored energy in here. Meanwhile, the pancreas, responding to the thing it's meant to respond to, glucose, says, well, I'll show you what's up. I'm going to send more and more insulin. I'm going to knock at your door harder, try to stuff this stuff away, because the body does not like excursions or roller coasters of glycemia or blood sugar. So there's kind of this battle at the cellular level of the fat cells being full, muscle and liver also full, or perhaps even fatty, and the pancreas saying, no, please stuff this away. And through this, we have this process of insulin resistance. Meanwhile, the liver, a key player in this process, can become fatty itself. The pancreas can get fatty, and the whole cycle just gets worse. And sugars go up, insulin gets higher, and abdominal obesity happens, etc. I like to tell my patients that I want people to think about prediabetes, which I sort of use loosely as a measure of insulin resistance, as carbohydrate intolerance, as our body's saying, look, I have so full of glucose and struggling to store it that I just can't handle it anymore. Type 2 diabetes, similarly, is carbohydrate toxicity. There's so much stored glucose in the form of fats that additional ingestion of those foods is toxic. Hyperglycemia is a state that we know causes an array of macrovascular sequelae down the road, and tons of cost and suffering. So this is a graph that just looks at low levels of insulin, again, promote a high level on the y-axis of fat breakdown, or the potential for fat breakdown. That is the state we want to be in if our goals are to lose weight and improve our metabolic health, whereas high levels of insulin, largely due to dietary carbohydrates, sort of are the lock and key that lock away stored fat. It is physiologically impossible, if not super difficult, to burn stored fat while eating a diet that is very high in carbohydrates and starches. And insulin resistance, like I just sort of said, is it's the outcome of this whole process. It's the underlying physiology that begets the development of hyperlinks anemia and then all of these modern day conditions that are related to it. So the branches of the same tree of hypertension, lipid dysfunction, hyperglycemia, essentially metabolic syndrome. Prior to its recognition of metabolic syndrome a couple decades ago, metabolic syndrome was called syndrome X. Before that, it was called insulin resistant syndrome. Like literally its sequela or manifestations were what it was called. And this precedes, as I showed you a little bit ago, the diagnosis of type 2 by 5 to 10 years. Then it's, I would argue, the foundation or the unifying link between modern chronic inflammatory disease. I didn't remember much from my med school pathology, but I was able to flip back and find this page. This is about from a decade ago, Robbins and Contrin. It's kind of the Bible of human pathology. And I think this says it all, and I wish that my medical, my physician counterparts and other providers would know this. And I guess it's my mission here is to share this: that the link between diabetes and obesity is mediated via the effect on insulin resistance. It is the common unifier, and from that process, looking on the right here, you can see that excessive insulin is central to really modern chronic disease: diabetes, vascular disease, dental caries, asthma, eczema, strokes, ulcers, lots and lots of cancers are rooted out from this physiologic dysfunction. On the left here, I mean, you can see that it's a lot of the conditions that keep us busy as healthcare providers, right? And it wasn't until I learned these things that I sort of see metabolic health and human health through another lens of this underlying metabolic physiology that's really is key to a lot of our chronic disease and suffering. This is from Dr. Eads, Mary and Mike, California, that published a great paper that just looked at, again, diseases of civilization, diseases of modernity, of wealth, and how they're very much linked by hyperlinks anemia and more than just metabolic syndrome. So the conventional paradigm of, excessive weight or obesity management, prior to the 60s, it was understood that there is a hormonal component here. That our grandmothers, our great grandmothers, they would have known that if you feed somebody or an animal, for example, lots of sugar and starch, corn, grain, potatoes, whatnot, that person or that animal is going to gain weight. That there's an underlying driver there, some sort of metabolic phenomenon, and we later learned that it was insulin. And so, yeah, despite understanding this, and one other interesting historical aside is prior to World War II, this was a commonly known concept in Europe. So the best, smartest physicians in the world, scientists, were of German and Austrian origin. They would have spoken and written German. It was known throughout Europe that if you wanted to improve somebody's sugars and metabolic health and weight, they ate less carbohydrates. However, we know what happened in the 1940s. With the rise of Nazi Germany in World War II, many of those scientists were either killed or exiled, and that there was a knowledge vacuum left in this space that was filled, as we have since learned in the 70s, by Dr. Keyes and this new hypothesis, which really entered and has since taken over this space of previous knowledge lost to a war and now refilled with this other idea that it's got to be the fat, right? Isn't a calorie a calorie? And if that's the case, shouldn't we just eat less, particularly less fat, and exercise more? Like, it sounds simple, right? But if it worked so well, we wouldn't be in this epidemic of diabetes and obesity. And furthermore, what this process or this idea tells us, it doesn't tell us anything about the how or the why, about why fat stores expand or why sugars go up. And as I've said earlier, we have as a country decreased our intake of saturated fat, yet we're getting more obese and metabolically ill. So something's missing here. Similarly, the management of diabetes conventionally has been really fascinating. So prior to the discovery of insulin, which I believe had its 100th anniversary this year, patients were treated with really the only tool that they know worked, which was dietary carbohydrate restriction. With insulin, however, which was a game changer, like a lifesaver for tons of people with type 1, it was found that if you administer this exogenous hormone, people's sugars come down, they can maintain a healthier body weight. That was inappropriately, I would argue, transferred into patients with type 2, which we know the common outcome of type 1 and type 2 is similar, hyperglycemia. But the central pathophysiology, the origin of these two metabolic diseases is distinctly different. Type 1 is a state of insulin deficiency, exogenous insulin being critical for health and survival. Type 2, however, we've already learned is insulin resistance. It's too much insulin. And so the whole then development over the 20th century of let's treat more and more type 2s with exogenous insulin, I think has gotten us into a difficult situation. I share, for example, with different sorts of thyroid dysfunction, with Hashimoto's, for example, we don't give those people Synthroid. People with Cushing's or high levels of cortisol, we don't give them steroids. We treat them with other mechanisms that balance out that hormonal defect. And so, as we all know, and we've seen this oodles of times, we keep dosing type 2s with more and more and more exogenous insulin, more Lantus, more Novolog, to control the hyperglycemia. And certainly, we've learned that insulin is like our mothers. It tidies things up, if you will. It improves the hyperglycemia, but it only does so by stuffing that glycemia or stuffing the glucose into fat cells or promoting lipogenesis. Again, it doesn't tell us anything about the how or the why or its detrimental downstream inflammatory effects. And we've since learned from some of the biggest, most expensive studies in the history of the country that tight glucose control, just glucose control, does not have any benefit in terms of cardiovascular mortality. And the way I want you to think about this is, sure, we've learned from these studies, like we can drive glucose down significantly. But if we're not seeing any improvement in cardiovascular outcomes, maybe it's the insulin itself it's the issue, not the glucose. Maybe it's both. So I want you to think about obesity as a marker of a dysfunctional cardiometabolic state, not the cause. and that generally, outside of some challenging, genetic situations such as Prader-Willi or significant obesity, people who have Pickwickian syndrome or simply have trouble breathing because they're so large, people don't die from obesity itself. They die from the metabolic consequences related to insulin resistance that's largely due to diet and lifestyle. Heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, CKD. I'd add to that COVID. Huge causes of mortality and cost in this world. From a brief COVID standpoint, having been the division chair at the hospital for a couple of years and led our inpatient COVID unit and cared for hundreds of people, including in the ICU, I have yet to see a metabolically healthy, we can argue vaccinated or not, mostly unvaccinated person get hospitalized with COVID. It is the convergence of two pandemics, of insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, abdominal obesity, plus a virus that is really phenomenal at taking advantage or hijacking that inflammation and taking it to the next level where there's systemic consequences. And I think hopefully now more than ever that is understood, and hopefully COVID's brought some of that tragically to the foresight that our metabolic health really matters. Let's talk about what eating and living this way is like. So physicians, scientists way older and before me have said things with, I'd say, a rich amount of wisdom that need some more attention and need to be dusted off here. This is Hippocrates, let food be medicine and medicine be food. And Maimonides, that no illness can be treated by diet. No illness which can be treated by diet should be treated by any other means. And I found that this is very true in my personal life and the many people that I've had the opportunity to serve here at Essentia. So what does this really mean? It's eating real foods that are generally low in carbohydrates, sugar, and starch, and higher in saturated fats and protein. Foods from animals or foods that our ancestors would have recognized or our great grandparents would have recognized. And I really try to preach this, that it's not a diet per se, it's more of a lifestyle. And I say this because it's about reestablishing one's relationship with food, both in terms of your mindset, your behaviors, but also the neurohormonal mechanisms that get improved when this way is adopted. And things like leptin and insulin and ghrelin, all of these key messengers between our brain and our gut are oftentimes dysregulated and can be improved. It's about appreciating the savoriness of food as much as the sweetness, which so many of us have been accustomed to and have an affinity for. And also it's recognizing that macronutrient quality is as important as quantity. So a calorie is not a calorie. If any one of us here had 100 calories of M&Ms, and on our other hand, 100 calories of avocado, maybe steak, salmon, or eggs, we ingest them both. Is the outcome physiologically and our hormonal mechanisms the same? Of course it's not. We know that with the M&Ms, even for those of us that are metabolically healthy, we're going to have an insulin spike. We're going to have a glucose spike. The cascade effect of that to our metabolic health and our weight is distinctly different than the other foods I mentioned. And the controlling insulin by promoting insulin sensitivity is key. And this is done by way of less carbs, by fasting, optimizing sleep, stress, exercise, medications, and that's what we do centrally in our clinic right here. I think a good way to break this down is sort of as a percentage of overall calorie intake, and this is just a general cursory overview. This is going to fluctuate from person to person. So the dietary intake of fats, mostly saturated fats, which are solids at room temperature, monosaturated fats like olive oil and others are included as well, are a higher percentage of one's calorie intake. Protein, 20 to 40%. Generally, I find this to be a little bit higher than pre-intervention or pre-dietary lifestyle change. But key here is that dietary carbohydrate dialed down from average American being 50 to 70% of dietary intake down to 5, 10, maybe 15, 20%, or on average, from a gram standpoint, 30 to 50 grams a day. Most people, most Americans are in that 325 grams a day average. And I've seen some people who have insulin pumps who are tracking carbs in the 500 to 600 grams a day average. So just a profound amount of dietary carbohydrate intake. And so what we help people learn to do here and coach them on doing is living and thriving successfully on a dietary lifestyle that has fewer carbs and focuses on nutrient-dense foods that have more protein and fat. It looks like this. We can call this what we want: paleo, keto, etc. Mediterranean low carb is a more common phrase these days. I call it some version of the real human diet. I mean, this is what we were we evolved on for the most part and have been designed to live and thrive on, not the things that we know are abundant in our society and processed foods that are making us ill. So this is, shoot, I just blew it. One extra click. I give this presentation to residents and med students and doctors and I ask this question, like, what is the daily requirement for us in terms of carbs, sugars, and starches to ingest through our mouth? Like, what is the minimum we need to be healthy? And I will proceed here by saying it's 0. There are essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, essential vitamins, nutrients, and there of course is water. But thanks to gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis, these inherent processes we have in our liver and our muscle, we don't have to ingest dietary carbs. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily my medical recommendation for you or for me or for anybody. I don't recommend that. I'm just saying, let's just recognize that to be a true physiologic starting point. And then from that, we can see that the 300 to 500 grams a day is just astronomical, and of course will lead to disease. So what does this look like? And this is from Diet Doctor, top low carb website, a wonderful site for knowledge and visuals and videos. On one hand, we have above ground veggies, we have cheeses, full fat dairy, eggs, seafoods, meats, real God-given, nature-given fats. This is what this looks like. Beverages, of course, water, coffee, tea, drier reds, drier whites in terms of wines. Nowadays, there's bubbly water. There's all kinds of things that can keep the palate nice and fresh and still not have any sugar sweetened components to them. For breakfast, this might look like bacon, eggs, avocado. Lunch, as you see there, some sort of a Cobb salad, and then dinner, a meat and a veggie, perhaps a side dish of mushrooms, perhaps Brussels sprouts, butter, or cheeses. Here, an array of fats, including, yes, lard and ghee. Again, things that our ancestors would have prized, would have saved to actually cook with, right? And olive oils, coconut oil, butter, etc. Protein, plants or animals, both fine. You're going to find that from an animal sources tend to have more dense protein content. In other words, to get your daily protein requirement of a minimum of 1 gram per kilogram, all the way up to 1.5 grams, you simply need to eat less meats to accomplish that. Certainly that can be done through a more veggie-focused diet. You just have to eat a lot more veggies if that is the lifestyle. So I'm big fan of both, and I think there's a lot more in common between keto, low carb, and even vegan and vegetarian. Both of these ways of eating, I would argue, have more similarities than they do to the standard American diet of processed carbs, sugars, and lots of bad trans fats. Produce, so above ground veggies, all are fair game, with the exception of corn, which is quite starchy. Anything that's green, salads, peppers, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, etc. Dairy and nuts, also wonderful options here. Not all dairy and nuts are created equal, and Diet Doctor has a great visual that has a spectrum of things. For example, cashews have the highest percentage of carbs per serving. On the other hand, you have nuts like macadamias and almonds, which have the fewest. And then fruits. Fruits are nature's candy, after all. Fruits naturally are sweet and have fructose. And historically or evolutionarily, we would have eaten them in higher quantities late season, so right end of summer, early fall, to fatten ourselves up like many animals do for the winter, so we wouldn't die. And nowadays we have extra large, extra sweet fruits year round in all of our grocery stores, and well, most people who I see for the first time don't believe me or understand. It's a banana and an apple can have remarkable consequences on one's blood sugar. Sure, they're natural and they're fruits, but it doesn't mean that the impact they have isn't potentially could be detrimental. Berries, however, generally have less of a glycemic response. Same things with lemons, limes, kiwis, etc. And these, when combined with some nuts or some heavy cream, are a great snack to have. So again, on one end you have keto, which is, depending on what you look at, under 20 to 30 total grams of carbs a day. You're going to see there's a relatively smaller serving size there. You're not going to see any of the added veggies. On the other hand, you see a more liberal approach, under 100 grams, but a bit higher in that 50 to 100 range. You see some sweet potatoes, a little bigger serving of some of the veggies and so forth. And we really try to tailor our approach to patients here to where they're starting from. If I'm seeing somebody for the first time and they're in that multiple hundreds of grams of carbs a day, lots of processed foods, no meal planning, untreated sleep apnea, etc. We're just keeping it simple. We're just trying to get them under 100. Over time, though, we know that this therapeutic approach can have transformative consequences as we lower dietary carbohydrates. And through this whole process, I emphasize keeping it simple, keeping it tasty, and keeping and keeping it keeping it fresh with new recipes. And there's plenty, as you all probably know, out there, things to explore in terms of lower carb recipes to check out. And really trying to focus on the things that one are able to eat or are choosing to eat, and not the I can't. The I can't is from a mental standpoint quite restrictive. Everything in life is choices, after all, and including our food choices. And so I do a lot of coaching on mindset and just trying to see this from a standpoint of I am choosing to eat these foods because ultimately my goal is to live a long and healthy life, and it's seems less restrictive and can help that way. Nutritional ketosis is a natural, evolutionarily metabolic state where the body is fueled in part by fats, the breakdown of stored fat via the liver, transformed into a couple major ketones, and most of our cells can utilize these ketones for fuel instead of carbs. And this occurs generally when insulin levels are low, not when they're high, and typically occurs when one's daily dietary carbohydrate intake is under 30 or under 20 grams a day. Fasting can augment this state as well. The brain will preferentially burn glucose if available, but it is happy most of the brain cells to also run on ketones. And I found, and many of my patients do, that if, entering this state for at least some time can be a great tool to help with weight loss, to improve energy, mental clarity, and of course help blood sugar and trends and insulin trends. Really key here, really key, and often misunderstood. This is not ketoacidosis. So ketosis is when measured, again, finger stick or breath. Your ketones are between 0.5 and 1.5 millimoles, so low, above zero, but low. And this is by many leaps and bounds lower than ketoacidosis, where the ketone levels, the beta hydroxybutyrate, is much higher. And physiologically, so long as we all have functioning glucagon is the hormone secreted by the pancreas that creates the floor so as to not let us drop our sugars too low, if you will, it is impossible for us to generally enter ketoacidosis, which generally occurs in type 1s who miss their insulin or are newly diagnosed. We can test for, if we choose to, ketones by way of breath, urine, and blood. All these are optional in our clinic. I don't recommend anybody do these off the bat. They can be a useful tool downstream to assess for compliance and improvement, but by no means are necessary. And of those three, you may be wondering which is the most accurate. It's going to be blood, least accurate, urine. Carbohydrate withdrawal, keto adaptation. I prefer these terms over the keto flu because they're more physiologically appropriate. This can take anywhere from a couple days to a couple weeks, depending on one's level of insulin resistance and carbohydrate intake. People may experience lightheadedness, cramps, constipation, and fatigue. The key here is to slowly decrease carbs while increasing fat. And central to this as well is liberalizing water and salt. Yes, I said salt, and that is because as you cut carbs, the kidneys actually will dump salt into the urine. In other words, the future urine salt concentration will be higher than what it is now. So it is not just important, but necessary to replace salt. When I see people get into problems, is oftentimes when I see people in consult who have started eating this way, but still take HTTZ, for example, haven't increased their salt intake, and they get lightheaded and dizzy when they stand. It's because their pressures are dropping too much. Stop the HTTZ, add a bit of salt back, things normalize. A really simple intervention to this is just to have a couple cups of bone broth or chicken broth per day. This is really important, and I emphasize this to anybody I chat with or articles I do or podcasts, et cetera, is the patients who are adopting this way of eating and are taking insulin or on high blood pressure pills or a statin, they follow with somebody like us to help them carefully follow and adjust or even de-escalate and stop altogether those medicines because of potential adverse effects, not from the diet, but from the drugs. The drugs can become too powerful for the new physiology of the person. So general guidelines, we talk about here not eating to live, don't live to eat, but eating to live. Sorry about that. And choosing to eat when hungry, really recognizing what that ghrelin growl, the growl we have in our upper abdomen is, which most people have not felt in years or have forgotten about. Recognizing that as a key barometer to choosing to stop when satisfied. There's a big difference between I'm eating and I'm no longer hungry, and I'm eating and I'm full. And I think most Americans, that's a razor thin margin that we can't really separate. But if we're intentional and choose to eat slowly and are really aware of how we're feeling, we can see there's a delta there. There's actually a decent gap between I'm no longer hungry, my ghrelin is no longer being secreted, and I'm really actually plump and overfull, if you will. There's a pretty wide gap there. So we do a lot of coaching and mindset training and awareness on that. Choosing to get real food and optimally growing it yourself, or at least knowing somebody who grows it. I believe the closer, more intimate relationship you can have with your food source, probably the higher quality that food is. Think about the farmer down the road, or maybe you all have chickens or venison yourself versus Costco, right? Big difference in terms of food quality. Consider labels as warning labels. Real food doesn't have labels. Steak doesn't have a label. Eggs don't have a label. Avocados, nuts, etc. Avoid sugar and its stealthy starch relatives. We've learned that on the surface, healthy whole grains primarily break down to glucose, stimulates insulin, and the rest of the cascade we've discussed. By far, the first thing I tell people about when I see them is not to drink your calories or sugar, is to eat them. That immediate hit via sugar sweetened beverage is really detrimental to the liver and the whole cascade of insulin physiology. But there's really no need to count calories. That this is not, the intent of this isn't to be a low calorie diet. There's no calorie counting. I don't even necessarily, at least initially, recommend carb counting. But in turn, because fats and proteins are more satiating, people tend to eat less calories. Think about, for example, 2 meals. One meal you may have is the breadstick, orange juice, and spaghetti. I don't know about you, but a previous me is going back for thirds. I don't know when to stop until my stomach is literally full of those things. Alternatively, my favorite meal these days is New York strip medium with a dry rub, side of mushrooms, broccoli, and blue cheese. Halfway through, if I'm really attentive to how I'm feeling, my hunger is gone. I may finish it, but I can't have seconds because it's really dense, right? It's really filling. And overall, people just tend to eat less. It's natural for people to see us back and say, I'm not really eating until 11 or noon. That's just fine. And the meal planning is critical. The more foresight and intention one can have with meals, the more likely we are to follow through with those meals, to have them be of higher quality, or I would argue to have less stress about them as a family, probably to save money over time as well. And to shop the periphery of the store, the center aisles of a store generally include one of 3 ingredients: flour, processed flour of some sort, or grains, added sugar, and trans fats. You keep it simple and stay to the periphery of the store. This is my daughter a couple years ago. This is her telling us to avoid fake food. Meanwhile, a couple other principles here where we're getting close to wrapping up, so bear with me. To avoid anything that's low fat, because generally the healthy fats are pulled out and the sugars are added. Think about yogurts. Dairy is a big prime example here. Eat local and organic if possible, but after all, organic gummy worms are still garbage, I would argue. Just because they have natural sugar doesn't mean they're not going to naturally raise insulin and glucose. Big thing I preach about to my male patients who are on the road a lot or trucking is to buy your gas and your food in 2 different buildings. Gas stations are generally food deserts and should be avoided as a food source. Cook with real fats if you can: butter, lard, coconut oil, olive oil. And to be really aware of those partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, which is really a code word for trans fats. The fats that, just like carbs and starches, were promoted in the 70s. We were also told that if you eat these, choose to cook in these fats, your cholesterol will go down. Meanwhile, they're extremely inflammatory and toxic to our vascular systems and should be avoided, again, alternatively to those that are God-given or nature-made, like those that I've mentioned. Focus on coffee, water, tea, alcohol, special occasions, dry reds, dry whites, perhaps a spirit with club soda instead of tonic, or a low-carb beer. I tell everybody that your tolerance for alcohol will drift downwards. A drink may feel like 2 may feel like 4, and that is due to a few things here, but should generally just be people should be aware of that. Alcohol is also unique in that it's really a triple hit to the system. So the alcohol itself can be metabolized into fat. The sugar in the alcohol, what it's mixed with, can become fat. We all know when you have a couple, you're probably more likely to snack on carbs. Well, we know what happens to that. And finally, microbrews, or brews that are higher in hops, are very estrogenic. So my male patients who love microbrews, I tell them, well, that's partially responsible for your man boobs. I mean, the estrogens in those, I will not argue how delicious that can be, but it can be very estrogenic, and that's really the quadruple hit for those sorts of things. And to enjoy low carb snacks if you're hungry, to have them in your bags, in your luggage when you're traveling, in your purse, in your car. And then finally, as I learned, and many of my patients have, you can't exercise or out of a bad diet. exercise in and of itself is not a good tool for weight loss. It's wonderful for happiness, connection, and weight maintenance, but we really try to help people understand their mindset, their mood, their food behaviors on the front end, adding exercise and coaching, a mixture of resistance training and cardiac activity down the road. And then finally, lean body mass is critical to health, wellness, and longevity. Lots of options here, plenty of cookbooks and websites. What does this look like? Well, do some research, find some new recipes. You, like my wife and I used to here, email back and forth. Here's the plan for the week. Let's actually be intentional and write this out and follow it. You shop for it, and then you bring it home and you cook it up. Then you enjoy it. Yeah, this takes time, but what greater investment is there than this outcome? And then I would argue when we're eating conveniently, we're simply taking time off the back end of our lives. Seems convenient now, but the outcome downstream, I would argue, is not ideal. Why does this stuff work? It is more satiating. We talked about feeling more full, more satisfied with more proteins and fats. That real food and cooking in real fats taste great. This is not a fad. This is the ultimate, and I would say the original human diet. It controls hunger and cravings. I haven't seen anybody come to me on a low-calorie, low-fat diet and tell me that their sugar cravings are under control. I have people every day tell me that their sugar cravings are absent when they eat this way. You distance yourself from that thing that is known to trigger our receptors in our brain that are associated with cue, response, and reward, and cravings for that substance will go down. The nutrient density of these foods is much higher, eliminates the most fattening foods, which isn't fat, it's carbs, and it stimulates lipolysis. If you have extra stored body fats to burn, you're more likely to do so in the form of being in nutritional ketosis and facilitating a state of lipolysis. And finally, and this I think is huge as we look at population health and cost of healthcare, we're de-escalating and usually discontinuing medications, saving costs, saving side effects, and then really inspiring patients. We're getting short on time. I'm going to try to fly through some of this. People often ask, low carb, low fat, where's the evidence here? This is a whole collection of RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, looking at low carb, low fat head-to-head. This is from 2018. Low carb is ahead at this point, 29.0. It's since 35.0 in terms of outcomes for weight loss and glycemic control. Let's see here. This is from Finney and Volek from Ohio State and the founders of Virta Health, looking at low carb versus low fat on markers of metabolic syndrome. Right, so glucose, insulin, blood pressure, triglycerides, HDL. As you can see across the board, lowering dietary carbohydrates has a much more profound impact on these measures than lowering dietary fat. Oftentimes worry and wonder, okay, I get all this stuff, but what about LDL? What about LDL? Isn't my LDL going to go sky high? Isn't that going to give me a heart attack? So my clinical experience here is fitting with the data, which shows that typically it stays the same. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. But I'd argue that it's not just the quantity, it's the quality of the LDL that matters. So if we can quantify LDL via an NMR, a special lipid test, we see that there's generally a shift from, in this example here, both states the person's LDL is 130. But there's a shift to the less atherogenic on the left, bigger kind of, imagine that to be like a fluffier, less dense state, versus the right, pattern B, which is small and dense. Think of those like BBs penetrating a wall. Those little dense LDL particles can penetrate the vascular endothelium, triggering a cascade of lipid response and ultimately the atheroma that develops into calcifications. So there's generally a shift here to the less atherogenic state. Kind of the poor man's way of assessing this, other than the NMR, which is quite expensive, is to look at triglyceride to HDL ratio. We oftentimes see this remarkable shift of lower triglycerides, higher HDL, which is a nice marker of the shift of, this LDL shift happening, favoring that on the left, pattern A. Tons of evidence, tons of guidelines, randomized controlled trials coming out promoting the background science for this, endorsed by the society that I'm board certified with, the Obesity Medicine Association, saying that it's better than low fat for weight loss, control of cravings, glucose, insulin, blood pressure, lipids, etc. And I'd say really importantly, most recently by the ADA. And to me, this is a powerful statement. Reducing overall dietary carbs for individuals with diabetes, and I'd say insulin resistance, has demonstrated the most evidence, not just evidence, but the most evidence for improving glycemia and may be applied in a variety of eating patterns tailored to the individual's needs. I just came out a couple years ago, and I think it was the final stamp of support and approval that I was waiting on. A lot of my colleagues were to really move on this. Alternatively, we know that on the other hand, the most expensive, largest, most rigorous sort of nutritional studies of our time, for example, the Women's Health Initiative, which was a low-fat intervention compared to a standard, did not show any protection against cardiovascular disease or some major kinds of cancers, and that their weights were generally the same as those following the traditional diet. I'm going to jump through all these, lots more evidence for a lack of low-fat promoting cardiovascular outcomes. And here we are, just a few years ago, from this kind of shift in the mass media to cholesterol, maybe it's okay, to a couple years ago, time saying eat butter. What does a visit look like here in our clinic? So we send out an intake form a couple weeks ahead of time, 4 pages, lots of questions about one's life and history. We ask about recent food intake, exercise, sleep, mental health, family history, health conditions, etc. Full examination includes waist circumference measured at the belly button, BMI examination, and then looking for signs of insulin resistance, which can be acanthosis or darkening skin around the neck, lots of skin tags. In females who maybe have PCOS, it's facial hair, it's irregular periods, it can be eczema or changes in body composition. So there's just that development of abdominal obesity. Based on labs, we look at the lipid panel. So we see this pattern of high triglyceride, low HDL. Again, that's one of the criteria for metabolic syndrome. Higher insulin or higher glucose. Very commonly and oftentimes missed by primary care is that high ALT. That ALT in the liver panel, maybe it's 38, maybe it's 45. It's kind of been hovering there for a while. That is almost always fatty liver, or the beginnings of type 2 diabetes. That's the seeding of it, if you will. Inflammatory markers like CRP are often high, and then a HOMA-IR score, which looks at insulin and glucose, is elevated. And in this first visit, I've done a couple of these today, where we really talk a lot about the pillars of wellness. So you're sitting on chairs with 4 legs, right? And those 4 legs have to be solid. They have to be rooted and attended to maintain health. This is nutrition, it's exercise, it's mental health and stress, and it's also sleep. The 5th pillar being medications when appropriate. And when we focus on low carb, nutrient dense foods, sometimes fasting, we also put a lot of attention into sleep apnea screening, exercise coaching, psychological support and counseling, and then sometimes using CGMs or glycemic monitoring when appropriate. We follow people regularly in ongoing education and check-ins to meet them where they're at going forward. Medications, commonly using metformin if there's any signs of insulin resistance. GLP-1s, more and more these days, if they can be afforded and tolerated, are really game changers. They help with appetite, glycemic control, and weight loss. When appropriate, phentermine, also topiramate, sometimes naltrexone, bupropion. All these are FDA approved for weight. Again, keeping it really simple here for patients. I direct them to Diet Doctor, top low carb site in the world. Most of it's free, very visually interactive and easy to use, and translating some of those new recipes and food choices into, depending on the person, if they're open to tracking initially, some form of monitoring macros, such as Carb Manager, which is an awesome app to use. A couple of recent examples here. 24-year-old guy, I saw class 4 obesity when I saw him with sleep apnea, fatty liver, insulin level that was sky high. Saw him first in 2019. He was 329, BMI 45. I haven't updated this recently, but last visit was last spring. He had lost 92 pounds in 18 months without any other medications. He's working full time. His mood's better. He's now running upstairs. Insulin from 35 to 9. Triglycerides down in half. His liver functions normal. A goal of under 200 pounds by his 25th birthday. Let me give you an update. I saw this guy this afternoon. He's down to 215, so not quite to where he wanted to be. His birthday was last week. Lots of stressors lately, a breakup, dad out of jail, some financial challenges. So, and here, and I'm only saying this because I saw him an hour ago, but a lot of my visit today wasn't about his diet or his weight. It was about coaching. He feels like he's a failure. He didn't get to 200 pounds like he hoped to. As I measured his waist and showed him that he's lost 14 inches of abdominal fat, and I strung that out in front of him, all of a sudden it clicked that, you know what, maybe I'm worth something. I'm doing good enough. And that's where so much of our attention and energy falls in these follow-ups. It's just helping people realize that that they're not failing, that it's okay to be human and to be in this state where you're still trying to achieve a goal, which is oftentimes difficult. More examples here, a lady who's down 90 pounds, said she's hiking again, new relationship with food, wants to be a role model for her grandkids. Insulin level is now normal, down to 4. Um, this person's up to 165. I actually just saw them today too, and has actually been inspired to go into this field as a specialist in weight management. Collectively, her family's down over 200 pounds, and they're doing things that they wouldn't have ever otherwise done together as a family. I don't want to just end with this because I know a lot of you are leaders in the system and have a particular interest in our community health and population health. So you may be familiar with the IHI, which is the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. They have a triple aim, which looks at population health, patient experience, and cost. So currently, I would argue that we manage or treat diabetes and obesity while these epidemics grow. Prescribe more drugs, people have more surgeries, they're in the ICU more often, costs are out of this world, and the people aren't happy for the most part. They're disillusioned, they're disheartened. Like, no one's ever given me a high five or cried in my office when I've told them that they're going on insulin. I mean, they've cried because they've been upset, not happy. We have this ability, and I believe we're doing it here in my clinic and throughout our system to some degree, to not just treat and manage, but to reverse diabetes and obesity with food, with lifestyle, with this comprehensive approach, where we discontinue medicines, leading to fewer downstream costs, fewer sequelae of admissions and procedures and so forth. Most importantly, grateful and inspired patients. That's what we're all doing this for. The hugs, the high fives, the tears that I get in my office daily, people living with renewed vitality. And I only hope that as this message spreads, that we can coalesce and we have bubbles of, Duluth, Brainerd, St. Cloud, hopefully the country where this is overlapping and we see this change, because the current pathway we know is not sustainable. Briefly, in our community, I've kind of taken the reins from Dr. Park as the unofficial system lead. We have a group of awesome providers here in Brainerd, myself, Deb Steen, who's next to me, Rhoda Reese behind me, Mel Palmer just joined our team, Katie Erickson, a new RN starting with us in January, 2 awesome LPNs and 2 psychologists from Duluth who actually drove from Duluth to Brainerd today to visit us and spend time with us. Those are Dr. Kelsey Berg and Lisa Van Blalen, who's a social worker. We refer to them often for psychological support and counseling virtually, and they've been awesome additions to our team. We use exercise coaching, both of our sleep docs locally as well. I have a monthly newsletter that's up to like 80 providers and people throughout the system where I send updates to. And I think as a community, we've really taken hold here. Lots of local restaurants are having, low carb nights or making low carb foods that are home delivered or the people can pick up that are very affordable. So that's been cool to partner as well. I've tried to get the word out there in different articles and doing this today, podcast and so forth, just trying to spread the word and clear up, like I feel like most of us do these days, misinformation about things, trying to be that voice of clarity and reason from my personal and professional experience. Big event a couple of years ago, the first low carb conference in Minnesota that I started was held in Pequot, just north of here. We had 410 attendees and some of the top speakers in the country, including my mentor, Dr. Westman from Duke. This was supported by Essentia, and has actually led to a lot of, I think, improvements in our community health downstream. A lot of the people from the restaurants that I just mentioned were there. A lot of patients who I ultimately saw were there. And it's been really cool to see people in the grocery stores years later and say, my cousin was at that event and I started changing things and now I'm down 50 pounds. Like, it's, don't underestimate the power of, a message or a passion to kind of slowly change the world. A podcast I did, and Diet Doctor, up to 35K downloads. I welcome you to listen to. And if you have friends or family in other parts of the country or world, Diet Doctor has an awesome low carb map where you can put in a location and zoom in and see which physician is located close to that location who is fluent in low carb medicine, probably obesity or lifestyle medicine certified. And that number I think is up to 700 now worldwide. Finally, Low Carb USA is an awesome resource for clinical guidelines and knowledge. My top 3 book recommendations would be Why We Get Fat by Gary Taubes, The Big Fat Surprise, Manita Teicholz, and any cookbook by Maria Emmerich. Maria is out of Hudson, Wisconsin, and if you're in in Barnes & Noble or Amazon, she kind of has most of the top low carb or keto cookbooks. Fat Fiction, awesome documentary on Amazon, $3, really worth watching. Looks at the science, politics, and history of our food guidelines. Sacred Cow looks at a very wonderfully done documentary on the nutritional, environmental, and ethical cases for better meat. And then Diet Doctor is a wonderful resource there. So my final thoughts would be that I, like maybe some of you or many of my patients, started off here on this journey walking into the dark. Didn't know what I was getting into, and not sure where I was going to end up and where this would take me. And this is a photo taken from Yosemite Valley by my friend Ryan. That's my wife and my friend Katie heading up to Half Dome at 3 a.m. But I will assure you that the outcome of this can be transformative. That ultimately, we individually and as a community can arrive at the top. We can ascend this mountain that seems insurmountable with each other's help and with this message that lifestyle matters, that coaching, that mindset, food relationship, sleep, activity, this comprehensive approach to one's health is what we need more than anything, more than any pills or procedures. So with that, I'm very hopeful. And it's moments like today where I'm taking time to chat with you all to give me that hope. And lastly, this is my last slide, I promise. The most important question I don't think we're asking our patients is, what are you eating? I ask that to everybody now, but I hadn't throughout the first 10 years of my career. And I wonder what difference I could have made in others' lives earlier on if I had. So thank you.